If not, we'll let Dr. Karron talk, and then we can do Q&A at the end.
That sounds good, Adam. We'll go ahead and I'm going to introduce Dr. Karron. She's got a pretty extensive bio here, so I'm going to do my best to try to hit as many points as I can. First up, I want to thank you very much for pretty much responding to our email requests for you to come and join our organization tonight. We really appreciate that. You send out some of these email requests and you don't know if you're going to get a response back from a high caliber leader in the community, and to hear you, enthusiastically say, yes, I would be love to be included and to educate our local community physicians. We thank you for that. So Dr. Karron's actually the professor of international health at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University in the Department of Pediatrics. She's a pediatric infectious disease physician, a virologist, a vaccinologist, and director of the Center for Immunization Research and the Johns Hopkins Vaccine Initiative. She's made substantial experience and evaluations with respiratory virus vaccines in adult and pediatric populations. She's been involved in many committees as it relates to vaccine development and stages, including some of the committees that were discussed by Dr. Rivkes when it came to Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, as well as on the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. So she has extensive knowledge in terms of what's being reviewed currently amongst the committee members, and I'm hopeful she can provide us some more guidance as well. I have a slew of questions that have been polling throughout the last week or so in your anticipation, and so I'm hopeful that we can get through as many of these as we can, and then we will pose it for what the audience would like to ask as well that we may not have covered. So it'll be pretty much a discussion between you and I, and Dr. Fear is free to chime in as well. But first, if you could please just give us a little bit more about your background and experience when it comes to vaccine development and your specific area of interest that maybe I didn't touch upon.
Well, first I'd just like to say thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you, and I really appreciate the invitation. And it's a special pleasure. I know you didn't plan this, but to be here this evening, having just listened all day to the FDA deliberations about the first COVID vaccine that will likely get emergency use authorization, or EUA. I've been a vaccinologist, as we call ourselves, for my entire career. It's remarkable to me that it's December. We didn't know the sequence of this virus until mid-January. So in less than a year, we have accomplished so much, and we are, going to be using a vaccine. A year ago, I was at committee meetings where we were talking about mRNA vaccines as vaccines of the future. And, the future is really here. So I think it's a remarkable accomplishment. And I think in our Q&A or our dialogue with Dr. Udesi, we'll talk a little bit about how that came to be, how this was accomplished. But I think that we should feel proud, because I think it's really a shared accomplishment. It's vaccine developers, it's our government investment, it's clinical investigators, it's volunteers who literally rolled up their sleeves and put themselves out there to be participants in trials. So this is really a shared accomplishment. As for me personally, as Dr. Udesi said, I'm a pediatrician, infectious disease doctor. I've worked for most of my career on vaccines, on vaccine policy, in particular on respiratory virus vaccines. With respect to COVID, I'm not currently involved in the trials. There are a couple of trials going on in my center that colleagues of mine are leading. One actually of this Pfizer vaccine that we heard about today, and then the other is the AstraZeneca vaccine, an adenovirus vectored vaccine. I am, though, on, I don't think we'll touch too much on the global plans for these vaccines, but I'm on something called the Kovacs Maternal Immunization Working Group. Maternal immunization is an interest of mine, and we could touch on that a little bit. So Kovacs is the facility that will allow for global distribution of these vaccines and other vaccines. So with that, maybe I should pause and maybe we'll start our dialogue and touch on a lot of points, and I hope answer some questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Karron. So we'll start off by hopefully in our discussion hit on a couple of different things so people understand what we're going to go through. One, we'll probably talk about the vaccine development process, understand a little bit about the trials. I know Dr. Rifke's mentioned some of this already, but hopefully you can highlight some other key areas as well. What strategies are available and that are being explored, such as the mRNA. Maybe get a little bit more into some of the studies themselves in terms of what they're looking at their protocols, maybe their data, what their endpoints are, both the primary and secondary, what specific related concerns people may have or have been sharing with us that they would like to ask someone of your caliber. What does it entail for some of these high-risk populations where they studied specifically in these studies? And then I think Dr. Rifke's did discuss a little bit about the logistics and distribution and the administration of the vaccine here in Florida. And then we did have just a little towards the end, kind of some of the plans that he had already mentioned. And as you touched upon it, from our standpoint, we had just had a discussion about COVID-related issues and what was going on in our hospitals right at the peak, I would say, in Brevard County towards the end of July, beginning of August. We actually were very fortunate to have two of our local physicians, both a pulmonary critical care physician, Dr. John Broden, and an infectious disease expert, Dr. Saima Abbas, do a similar Q&A format with our group and highlight what the concerns were. And our last slide, I was just looking back, was warp speed and talking about what is going to happen with vaccines. And to see something change literally within 4 months, I think is pretty remarkable to see that as well. So we're noticing that there is progress being made on all fronts. But just to give an idea today, where do we still stand with our community as it relates to COVID? This is the data that was taken yesterday, again, from the Florida Department of Health, their dashboard. You can see the positive residents that we've had during this time, almost 16,000, the hospitalizations over 12,000, deaths over 460, patients. So it's still impacting what's happening in our community. You could see also the cases from the past 7 days, over 1,000 here in our county, and then over the past 2 weeks, almost 2,000. So it's still happening in our hospitals and our systems, and I think this is something that our providers are realizing, and I want our community to understand. And so, it's important that we start looking at the vaccine options and realize that, as Dr. Rifke's was saying, this could be as early as next week for some of our providers potentially. So with that, I'm going to ask you first, if you could please explain to us, what the typical vaccine timeline generally is and would be, and how with this pandemic protocol, things have happened so fast. I know that's a concern people are curious about. Are there any shortcuts? Are there any limitations? How did it get so quick? And maybe you can help us better explain how they took a process that accordingly could have taken many, many years and have done this in a matter of less than a year to months. So if you could please help us better explain that, we'd appreciate it.
Of course, sure, I'd be happy to do that. So typically, and I think this slide is perfect and very informative. And typically what happens is that, we do these trials in phases, phase 1, 2, and 3 prior to licensure, and then often something called phase 4 after licensure occurs. Phase 1 is first in human studies where we're really primarily focused on safety. We also can look at the immune response. It's usually tens of individuals. If we look at the data from those phase 1 trials, and I skipped over the preclinical studies, but we can talk about those if we want to, those are usually a prerequisite, and that information is shared with the FDA prior to initiating any human trials. And we'll talk a little bit, I think it'll be interesting to talk about the role of the FDA and all of this, and they've been particularly proactive this year, and we can, and in I think a very important way, and we can talk about that. After those data are available, they're evaluated by the company, they're evaluated by data safety and monitoring boards, they're evaluated by institutional review boards, and then if signs look favorable, move on to phase 2 trials, which are larger studies, essentially also looking at safety and immunogenicity, If those trials are favorable, then companies will move into phase 3 trials. You know, there are a lot of factors that go into that decision making. Of course, there's safety and immunogenicity, immune responses, but quite frankly, there are also economic decisions that go into that. And companies are looking around to say, what is the, you know, what is the reception going to be for this vaccine? What is the, you know, quite frankly, it's an investment. So what is the market going to be? What does the competition look like? Will there be a market when after this vaccine is produced? So that's typical. And what I would also say, and just to make really clear, is that before a company ever starts with a clinical vaccine trial, they meet with the FDA and they talk about what their clinical development plan is. And they talk about eventually how they want to do their efficacy trials and what their endpoints will be. And that's a matter of, they'll present their ideas, but that's a matter of negotiation with the FDA. Does the FDA agree that those endpoints are appropriate endpoints? So that's just to say that's the usual. And it takes a lot of time for a number of reasons. It takes time in part because things are done in a stepwise way, but it also takes time because of the resources that are brought to bear. And at every step, you know, there are more resources. And there's been a lot of discussion in the vaccine community about what are called valleys of death, which is, you know, when you're developing a vaccine, are you going to make the next investment? Is this a place where a product gets off track because you don't have the resources or you don't see the market? So with that as background, just thinking about the COVID vaccines, it's a very different scenario. So here, I think everyone probably listening and many others would agree, vaccines are our way out of the state we're in. Vaccines are our way out of the pandemic. So there is no question about market. I mean, right now we are in the situation of having to very carefully apportion the vaccines we do have. Eventually we will have vaccine for everybody, but it won't be tomorrow. So that is not a question. And investment is not a question because our government, we as taxpayers, have decided already to invest in these vaccines, and rightfully so. But so from a company perspective, number one, there's no risk. Number two, we were able, typically efficacy trials, often it depends on the pathogen, it depends on the attack rate, but efficacy trials often have 3,000 to 5,000 people. That's a typical size for an efficacy trial. And here, you know, we could have done COVID vaccine efficacy trials with 3,000 to 5,000 people. But the problem with that is timing, because if you need to have events, if you need to have COVID infection, SARS-CoV-2 infections and COVID disease in order to see whether your vaccine works or not, the more people you enroll, the faster you can get to that endpoint. And we're all highly aware of the need to understand quickly whether these vaccines will work or not. But the other piece of that that's really important is for people to understand is that gives us a safety database that is also large, because we don't have safety on 3,000 individuals or 5,000 individuals. We have safety on 10 times that number, 30,000, 45,000 individuals. So it does give us a large safety database. The other thing that's, I think, really useful, and I am sort of, despite everything, I'm an inveterate optimist, so I'm always a glass half full person. This is a time when vaccine development and evaluation is at center stage. We develop and evaluate vaccines all the time, right? but it's not usually done when the whole world is watching. Not that anyone's trying to hide anything, but it's not on the front page every single day, all the time. So what I've said to people is, if we do this right, if we are transparent in our communication and in our processes, we can build confidence. This is a national and a global teachable moment with respect to vaccine development and evaluation. If we communicate correctly and we do it right, we can build confidence in the whole enterprise. And conversely, if we do it wrong, we not only decrease confidence in COVID vaccines, but we may decrease confidence in all vaccines. One other really important thing, I think, just to say about this is around this transparency issue. So there are a couple of things that the FDA has done that I think have been incredibly useful. One was that they issued guidance this summer about what were their criteria for licensure of a COVID vaccine. Their guidance is non-binding, but it gives companies a clear idea of what their expectations are. And then this fall, very specifically, they issued guidance for emergency use authorization for EUAs that were far more stringent than what is minimally required for an EUA. And we can, if we have some time, we can talk about that, but much greater requirements. So that's a lot of talking for a single slide, but let me just pause there and we can go forward.
No, I think you explained it very well. And I think one of the questions, and I think Dr. Ripke's also, alluded to the statement of vaccine hesitancy. And I think one of the concerns sometimes people have shared with us is just, how quick this was developed. But I think you kind of hit the points in terms of why it was so rapid. I think there was certainly the population base that we could look at and pull from very quickly that we couldn't traditionally do with most vaccines. Additionally, the funding was there. From my understanding and from what I was trying to investigate a little bit, was normally the phase 3 funding wasn't going to come until you do phase 1 and phase 2 and have success. This was almost the government's going to give you the phase 3 money to go ahead and produce what you need to produce. If it works, go forward. If it doesn't work, we'll pick up the tab. And then I think that may have been one of the issues where this has kind of gone and escalated at that pace, because as we get into some of the efficacy numbers, you're looking at 60,000 doses or 30,000 doses. You have to be very cautious in terms of the investment. So it seemed like a financial circumstance that seemed to be solved for some of the vaccine makers, as well as the fact that you had a disease process that was so widespread. And so I think that at least eases some concerns as to how this came so fast that you traditionally wouldn't have get. So I appreciate you highlighting that for us as well. I'm going to go on to the next slide, or you can, please do make a comment. Yeah.
One more, actually two super quick follow-up points to that, to those things. One is just to say, not only investment for production of vaccine for the trials, but as I think everybody knows, the reason we have vaccine to distribute now to start is because there was investment made in manufacturing of vaccine for distribution before we knew if vaccines would work, with the idea that, if something didn't work, we might have to throw away those vials. But if it worked, we would have vaccine ready. The other thing just to say is, just because an EUA is issued, the trials are not over. And there was a lot of discussion today with the FDA about how those trials will continue and the details, but there will not only be safety follow-up of the individuals who are in the trials, but a number of ways, both existing vaccine safety follow-on systems and COVID-specific vaccine safety follow-up systems for people who are immunized in the course of mass immunization campaigns. So just to say those two things.
No, that's great. That's great. I'm going to move on to and this kind of also shows us, I had taken this slide, I'm not sure when, this was as of early November. Things may have changed since then, just to give us an idea of the global initiative that's actually happening with this. This is not just, a one country, one company scenario. You can definitely see and get the points here of how many other individuals are involved, and maybe can touch upon the different types and strategies that they've been exploring. I don't know if you can kind of educate us a little bit on some of the different strategies that these different vaccine makers are looking at.
Yeah, so there are almost as many different strategies as you can imagine. We're talking here in this country about mRNA vaccines this week and next week. There are DNA vaccines being developed. There are what are called viral vectored vaccines, and the ones that are furthest along in development are these adenovirus vectored vaccines, but there are other kinds of viral vectored vaccines, and there are protein subunit vaccines. So a number of different types.
And I think this kind of highlights some of those areas that you were highlighting in terms of the different methods that are there. And I guess as of now, these are the ones currently in phase 3 trials. And I think that the two most that people are interested in, obviously, seem to be both the Pfizer BioNTech and then the Moderna vaccine as well. But just to give us an idea, when you look at the numbers here as far as participants for vaccine studies, how does that compare traditionally to other vaccines that may have been studied, the number of individuals that they've been enrolling, and just to get an idea how it compares to other vaccines?
Yeah, and so that was, I think, a little bit of what I was mentioning before. It depends a little bit on the disease, and certainly this is not the first time we've enrolled 30,000 people in a vaccine trial. Certainly for some of the rotavirus vaccines, because we were looking for rare adverse events. There was the trial of pneumococcal vaccine for adults enrolled about 30,000 individuals, but it's not typical. A typical efficacy trial would be about 10-fold less than that, more on the order of 3,000 to 5,000.
So you can certainly see there's a significant amount, as you were saying, almost a 10-fold increase when you look at the participants in some of these studies. And I think one of the curiosities that some of us have as well is if you can explain a little bit about the mRNA strategy that's been being used, and is this live attenuated, or is this just using a portion of our kind of translational mRNA to go ahead and say, let's make antibodies to a spike protein without actually infecting you with anything per se. So if you can kind of, answer that question in terms of what the mRNA process looks like and how that vaccine kind of gets.
Sure. And by the way, thank you these are great slides, just have to say. They're great. But just to explain, so as you mentioned, this is not it's not a live replicating vaccine. What happens with mRNA is that all of these vaccines are betting, and it looks like it's a good bet on the spike protein of COVID-19, of SARS-CoV-2. So that's an outer protein, and we know that most of the neutralizing antibody to the virus is directed against that protein. And mRNA is made for this that encodes this spike protein. And actually, there's a fair amount of work that was done to make sure, this is a bit of inside baseball, but to make sure that the spike protein was in exactly the right conformation to induce good neutralizing antibody. And it turns out that that really might matter. So it's not just I think of the mRNA as the vehicle, but really it's the spike protein that at the end of the day is the payload that you're delivering, and it was made to be in a specific conformation. That mRNA is within a lipid nanoparticle, because if you just injected bare naked mRNA into a person, it would be degraded. It wouldn't get anywhere and it wouldn't do anything. So a lipid nanoparticle, so cells, the outer, we all remember from medical school that the outer membrane of cells is lipid, and these nanoparticles are lipid, and so it allows basically the lipid nanoparticle can fuse with the cell. The mRNA can go into the cell and then encode spike protein. As I think a number of people have said, it makes the body do the work. If you're going to make a subunit protein and give that to people. It's to manufacture that on a large scale is hard. Essentially, what we're doing is we're having our own bodies be that manufacturer. We give the mRNA and our bodies make that protein. And then we make antibodies and T-cell responses to that protein.
All right, that makes sense. At least from our standpoint, a better explanation and kind of putting some of our, healthcare individuals and some of the people that have been asking us what type of vaccine, is really being looked at, and is anybody actually getting, the virus or any form of that? And certainly what you're seeing and what you explained, that's not the case with the mRNA setup. So with that, I think there are two studies that I think we want to try to boil down a little bit more on, and maybe you can tell us a little bit how these studies were designed, and that kind of goes through what they're saying in terms of their endpoints as well. And so this is kind of one of the diagrams I took. This is the public information that they've been putting out, and I think Dr. Karron was also very nice to share with me, and I'm going to post it on our website as well, of the 5 different vaccines, I think, and their protocols for each one of those. And I had taken some of the snippets out of those, protocols to kind of show what the study flow diagram. And if you can kind of go through this a little bit, especially for the Moderna vaccine, to get us an idea of how many people were enrolled, how they were stratified, and then what kind of they measured when it came to their efficacy, of how those numbers, we just hear in the news 90% or 100% against severe COVID-19, but if you can give us a better idea of how those numbers come about.
Sure, and I will. I'm just going to enlarge things a little bit for me and my eyes. That's probably better. Maybe I can just speak a little bit first, because we have it up here first, of the Moderna vaccine, and also just to say, this is not one of the other things that's atypical about these trials is that these protocols are in the public domain. And that's because usually that information, of course, is shared with the FDA, but it's proprietary to the company. So in non-COVID circumstances, these are not protocols that are open to the public. Here, we're investing in these products, we, the taxpayers. And so actually, it's really a great opportunity for us to see how this is done. And what I probably won't go through huge detail in this, except to say first, for the Moderna vaccine, there are about 30,000 individuals enrolled. It's a 1-to-1 placebo randomized trial, so that people have a 50% chance of getting vaccine or placebo. These are studies done in individuals over 18 years of age, but it's stratified because of the greater severity of disease in the elderly. Moderna wanted to be sure to get, and the FDA and everyone, to get adequate information on the efficacy of the vaccine in the elderly. So there's a stratification of individuals above 65 years and under 65 years. And it's 2 doses. And the one other thing I just wanted to say, which is not so much in the study design, but something I really applaud, and something that will be transformational in vaccine development going forward, is a recognition that as we heard earlier from Dr. Rifke's, burden of severe disease is much greater in ethnic and racial minorities, and a real effort to include those populations in these trials. And Moderna, and actually both companies, worked very hard at this. Moderna actually had bar graphs. So you could go to their website and every week look and see what proportion of their enrollees were minority populations. And I think it's really so important, and so important when we think about implementing these vaccines. And I think it will be transformational. I think we won't go backwards after that. I think in trials to come, whether for COVID vaccines or for other vaccines, we're always going to be asking these questions that, quite frankly, we should have asked a long time ago. So that's the Moderna vaccine. And I guess I should just also say that for Moderna, the doses are given a month apart. Anything else that you wanted me to say about that one?
Out of curiosity, I know as well when they were looking at the efficacy rates for these studies, initially what the goal was looking at, can you achieve greater than 50%? Is that what the initial targets were for EUA? Is that what they were looking at that stage?
Well, so yes, so in the guidance that the FDA released this summer, and then for licensure, and then for EUA this fall, the minimum was 50% efficacy. And that's really because this was a brand new product. A brand new virus. People didn't know what the efficacy was going to be. The truth is, and of course hindsight's 2020, that it turns out that this is a terrible virus for humans and a terrible disease, but a rather easy vaccine target. This is not HIV or TB or malaria. I think that we should expect that most of our vaccines, I don't think we're going to accept 50% efficacy anymore. I mean, we said that when we had no idea, but now that we have vaccines that are 94, 95% efficacious, I don't think we're going to go backwards from that.
And then let's take a look also then, I think, at the next study. This was the Pfizer BioNTech one as well. Again, we'll try to share all these protocols with you guys. They're publicly available, as you mentioned, kind of nice, and indicates here as well some of the groups of individuals, and I think they did some stratification as well with their group. But if you could also just highlight for us maybe some of the differences between the Moderna and the Pfizer and BioNTech vaccine, for us to kind of know as well.
Yeah. So, and I will just say, so it's interesting. So, so Pfizer originally said that their vaccine was more than 90% effective across age groups. And one of the things I can also share with you is they shared all of their data in preparation for the EUA. So it was funny because when they said more than 90% and they said how many people were in their trial, I made my students calculate, and they said how many cases there were. I said, so, okay, if it's 90%, how many were in the vaccinees and how many were in placebo recipients? Because they learned how to calculate vaccine efficacy, and it was a nice little exercise. However, it turns out that the Pfizer, the point estimate actually when they did their final analysis was 94%. These numbers are not different. And the endpoints, Pfizer and Moderna had actually rather similar endpoints for their primary endpoints, which was COVID infection plus any disease. So any symptom plus being, PCR positive gave you an endpoint. Both of these vaccines, by the way, there are small numbers of severe cases, and we'll have to see, but both of these vaccines are, by report, 100% effective against severe disease in the populations that were studied. And this may be somewhat counterintuitive to people, but it's actually easier to prevent severe disease than it is mild disease. In part because it has in part to do with how these vaccines work, particularly for respiratory viruses. You can prevent systemic infection and lung infection more easily than you can prevent infection of, say, the upper respiratory tract, which might give you milder disease. So it's something we've certainly seen for flu, and we've seen, experimentally for other respiratory viruses. So that result is, time will tell because it's small numbers for the severe endpoints. But it's entirely consistent with what we've seen for other respiratory viruses. The breakpoint for Pfizer was a little bit different. in that they did stratify, but their break point was 55 years rather than 65 years. They gave their vaccine 3 weeks apart instead of 4 weeks apart. And then they also, as I mentioned, both companies had data around severe endpoints. The data presented to the FDA are, I have to say, and I expect the same will be true of Moderna, but we haven't heard theirs yet. The data presented were just incredibly striking. There was a sort of a survival curve where you look at COVID rates in placebo recipients and COVID and vaccinees, and I just, you know, in all my years as a vaccinologist, I've never seen curves like those. 94, 95% is it's stunning. I mean, it's really quite a stunning result. So, and I guess, you know, if people, because I guess this is a question that would come up, is how different are these vaccines? And my personal view is they're not very different. The lipid nanoparticle, that shell that I talked about, those shells they're proprietary, so I don't know what's in them. They are, I suspect, a bit different. And that's actually what accounts for the different storage requirements. You know, the fact that the Pfizer vaccine has to be stored at ultra low temperatures, and the Moderna vaccine isn't quite as temperature sensitive. That has to do with the LNP, with the lipid nanoparticle, but the guts of it, the mRNA itself, is virtually identical between these two vaccines, and the efficacy data are identical, really. So,
and just kind of to hit on some of the efficacy numbers that you're mentioning and what, you know, the Pfizer team and BioNTech were presenting, you know, how long do they have to have those patients enrolled in those studies to make those numbers? Because I know when you look at the study designs for some of these, they're going to be followed, as you said, even after EUA for maybe 25 months, if I'm not mistaken, or 24 months. You know, does that skew at all the, you know, the percentage there? Are they, when they look at the vaccine studies, is the 2-week time period that they look at after you know, a vaccine, is that sufficient enough? Is that what they were presenting? Or, you know, is it going to change, do you think, you know, later in time? Yeah.
Well, so I think maybe what you're getting at, so there had to be, so for EUA submission, there had to be a minimum of, well, not a minimum, a median of 2 months of follow-up for all of the participants. And so they didn't submit their data for an EUA until they had a median follow-up of that long. That means some individuals longer and some individuals shorter. What that does mean, and I think it's a question that might come down the road, but we can answer it here, is what do we know about the durability of protection of these vaccines? And the answer is, today, right now, we don't know a lot because we don't have that information. What we do know is that the level of antibody induced is far higher, looks like it's far higher than the level of antibody induced by natural infection from what data we have. So we don't think that antibody would disappear overnight. We know we induce T-cell responses too. We probably induce memory B cells. So even if your antibody drifts down a little bit, if you're exposed, you probably have a sort of a natural booster response. But we don't know. And I think that's one of the reasons to follow individuals in these trials, is to begin to get some idea of how long this immunity will persist.
And then it's, from what you're also describing, maybe some of their primary endpoints may also have other benefits, such as, you know, understanding about the antibody load potentially as it relates from that aspect of it. So not only just in terms of, you know, the prevention of disease or the prevention of serious illness, but maybe we can learn more from these studies as they progress, as you mentioned about antibodies and the load that might be there as well. So I'm going to move on to our next question and slide. And I think this was just looking at, reactogenicity, right? What were some of the adverse effects or some of the concerns that were experienced with the vaccination in these patient populations? And I think this was maybe something that also Dr. Rifke slightly mentioned as well. In the older population, there may have been, a little bit more symptoms. But this was, I think, one of those things that people always have concerns about. What are some of the symptoms that you might have or the adverse reactions that you could potentially experience? And so I don't know if you can touch upon that as well.
Sure, sure. So actually, first, just to say, it's actually the opposite, that older people have fewer reactions. And that's typical, actually. That's not a surprise to us. Younger people tend to, with all kinds of vaccines, if you're going to have a reaction, you tend to have more of a reaction if you're younger than if you're older. But these vaccines cause reactions, and they're similar, and I think it will be particularly helpful in talking to older populations when they get these vaccines. They're similar to Shingrix, to the shingles vaccine. So you may feel crummy, really not well for a day. There are local reactions, your arm can be very sore. There are fevers, there are chills, there are muscle aches. Usually these are short-lived. They can be 24, maximum 48 hours. So it's a very short-lived process, but it can be intense for some people when it happens. And I think to Dr. Rifke's point about, it may be that you don't want to give it to everybody in your hospital unit all at once, because some people may not feel very well for a day. The other thing that just people have to think about is a lot of these symptoms are similar to what COVID symptoms could be, right? So I think it's important to educate people that if these symptoms occur within 24 to 48 hours, chances are that these are vaccine related, that you don't necessarily need to seek. Obviously, if this persists, then you need to seek care and you may need to seek diagnosis, but not in that immediate short term.
And then just curiosity as well, I don't know if you had a chance to look at some of the news that was coming out from the UK that they had put out. I think yesterday they had some concerns because they were rolling it out. I think there were 2 individuals that they had concerns with that may have had anaphylactic type of reactions. And I don't know if they made any regulatory changes or concerns about that. But I think those 2 individuals specifically, I think they had a history of, severe allergies. They seem to carry EpiPens for other reasons. And I don't know if that was something that you could touch upon or knew about or knew a little bit more detail.
Yes, no, thank you for bringing that up. That's exactly as you said. There were 2 individuals in the UK who had, serious allergic reactions that required epinephrine. So that was actually a topic for discussion in the FDA meeting today. And what I think is likely to come out, and Mansef Slawi, who's the head of Warp Speed, spoke to this, but this is an issue. What may come out is a recommendation that individuals with a history of severe allergic reactions perhaps not receive these vaccines. Now, it's a problem. There are a lot of people, who carry EpiPens out there in the world. And I think one of my colleagues suggested, and I actually think this is a good idea, that that the company do a small controlled study, very well controlled, under, with an allergist right there, of people with those sorts of reactions of these vaccines. Because if you tell all those people that they can't receive these vaccines, that's potentially a problem. But I think that's where at this moment, I think the data are still coming out. The FDA indicated that they are talking to their sister regulatory agency in the UK to get more details about this. But I think that's where we may be going. You know, somebody also pointed out in the FDA meeting today, and of course it's true, that anyone who gives a vaccine at any time should be prepared to treat for anaphylaxis, right? It is just what you should be prepared for if you're going to be administering vaccines. So.
You know, just to kind of highlight one point, I'm an interventional pain specialist. So with us, our concern is we're always administering contrast to patients, right? And you're never sure if there's going to be a reaction or not. But one of the things, you're in the setting of which if there is a reaction, that could certainly be addressed. And I think those are things that one of the things they made a point of is when you're going to be finding that these will be rolled out, hopefully in hospital settings, that there's the proper scenario to see what happens as well. And then one of our infectious disease specialists had posed a question that maybe you can better clarify than I can. Is there any potential risk with the mRNA and disease enhancement potentially? Has that been seen? I think she had mentioned there were probably previous vaccines, maybe with dengue or something in the past that may have had disease enhancement as it related to that formulation. Is there any concern or discussion about that with what we currently have now?
Yeah, so people have talked about this quite a bit and looked at it very carefully. It was something that came up in the earliest days of vaccine development. So in January and February of this year, there was a lot of discussion about potentials for disease enhancement. There's been a lot of work on this. There's been no evidence of it in these efficacy trials. People have also looked very carefully in animal studies and, done autopsies in animals to look for evidence of immune complex deposition, disease enhancement, and have not seen it. The other thing is, based on what we know about disease enhancement for dengue, for RSV, which is something I work on quite a bit, it would be unusual to have high titers of neutralizing antibody to a pathogen without a lot of antigenic diversity, which we don't really have for this virus at this time, and to have disease enhancement. But even so, it was looked for in these trials, it was looked for in the animal models and not observed.
Okay, excellent. So that's good to know. I think one of the questions that we kind of want to look about is also about specific questions that people have had as far as vaccination and who should get it when it comes to COVID status. I believe, and you can maybe clarify, all these patients that were enrolled in this study were COVID negative, right at the beginning. I think and now, is that still the recommendation if you're COVID negative that you should only be looking at getting a vaccine, or if you have tested positive previously to COVID and recovered, are you still a vaccine candidate? Yes or no, and what the time frame might be? I don't know if you have anything, any new insight on that aspect.
Yeah. So a few things. One is, so although people who had a history of COVID, if you said I was PCR tested and I was positive, you were excluded from the trials. That was true. But when people looked at antibody at day 0, and all of the people who were enrolled, indeed, there were some people who had been probably asymptomatically infected or who had minor symptoms and were never tested. So indeed, they had people in the trial who previously had COVID, obviously a very small proportion of the enrollees, but still they had some. Those people did respond to vaccine and didn't have any different, their safety profile was no different. So the answer to the question is we think this can be safely given to individuals who had COVID before. The second part of that question, I think, really goes to, do people like that need the vaccine and should they get the vaccine? We do think that immunity wanes. We do think that these vaccines induce higher titers of antibody than natural infection might in some circumstances. And that's also, just to say, that's really variable. A person with really mild COVID probably makes much less antibody than a person who's been hospitalized in intensive care and probably has something to do with viral load, but that's an aside. I think, you know, there is still a question about if you had known COVID at a time when we don't have a lot of vaccine to give out, should you have the same place in line, or should you be moved a little further down the line? And, you know, I think that that's probably something that's going to be decided at the state and local level, how you deal with that. Because of course, for all the people that you know who had COVID, it's not going to make sense from a public health perspective to go out and antibody test everybody. And certainly there are going to be people who've had COVID who weren't particularly symptomatic but have antibodies. So I think that I think ultimately those people will be advised to get vaccine. I think it's just a matter of where they fall in line. I wanted to say something. I know we're going to talk about other high-risk groups, but I wanted to say something, if I could, about pregnancy, because it's something I've written about recently, and it was actually something that was talked about at the FDA today. We unfortunately, and I don't have good data on these vaccines and how they work in pregnant women and how safe they are. I think we're not worried so much about how they work as how safe they are for the woman and for her baby. We know, and the CDC I think has quite convincing data, that pregnant women are a high-risk group for COVID. And the issue has particularly come up, and there will be trials, and Pfizer and Janssen, and I don't know for certain about Moderna, but I know for certain that both Pfizer and Janssen are planning, and I think also Novavax ultimately, are all planning specifically trials in pregnant women. In part, the animal studies, those preclinical studies, were not completed. Some of them, Pfizer announced today that theirs will be done in the middle of this month, in a few weeks. The question that's arisen is, what about pregnant and lactating healthcare workers in particular, as we're rolling vaccines out? What do we do for those individuals? And just one other comment, and I think everybody can probably appreciate this, we lump pregnant and lactating women together. Biologically, that doesn't really make sense. An effect on the unborn fetus from vaccinating a pregnant woman might be very, very different from the potential for transmission, especially of a non-replicating agent through breast milk. So it's really, we lump them together, but indeed they're really kind of apples and oranges, and we should probably disaggregate them. So there are about 330,000 either pregnant healthcare workers, people involved in healthcare, or pregnant or women who have just delivered who are newly lactating. It's not a small population. And of course, there are I think that there should be opportunities for those women to not be on the front lines of healthcare, you know, and to be in less risky positions, but those opportunities don't always exist. Healthcare systems can't always support that, even if they want to, particularly in these times. And so, and what was interesting is that the UK regulators actually said specifically, pregnant women can't get the Pfizer vaccine. You actually need to have a pregnancy test before you get the vaccine. You have to not plan to get pregnant for 2 months after you get the vaccine, because we don't have any data. And what my colleagues and I published something in Stat 2 days ago that just said, thinking about these FDA recommendations, that ultimately the FDA should have what we would say is permissive language, meaning that ACIP, it's unfortunate that we don't have data at this time. It's premature, certainly, to give any positive recommendation for use in pregnant or lactating women, but this is something that should be decided by ACIP and by the professional societies, ACOG and the Society for Maternal and Fetal Medicine, which has already come out with a position, a positive position on that, and for ultimately providers to decide with their patients, you know, that there should be permissive language. That was actually discussed during the FDA meeting today, and indeed, I think their position is that they will likely have that kind of permissive language. So that's just one high-risk group that I think about a lot. There are other high-risk groups. Ethnic and racial minorities, we know, are high-risk groups. And part of, I think we will hear from ACIP about priority groups. And I think some of the prioritization will have to do with populations that are at high risk because of occupation. Certainly when we think about frontline workers, those individuals are often disproportionately racial and ethnic minorities. And so that's certainly an issue. And then of course, the elderly, and most particularly, people living in long-term care facilities. And the mortality of those populations is, particularly people living in long-term care facilities, is so high that really drove the ACIP recommendation. It was really a co-recommendation for immunization of high-risk healthcare workers and immunization of elderly people in long-term care facilities. So that's a long answer to your question, I think.
No, that was very helpful. And I think with that, you know, when we talk about the elderly patients as well, one of the questions people seem to have is they're also getting flu vaccine, they're also getting zoster vaccine, they're getting these other vaccines around this same time. Are there concerns they need to be cautious with, a time frame of getting, you know, a potential COVID-19 vaccine while they're getting something else? Is that there are any contraindications that are listed as of now related to that?
Well, so the FDA hasn't come out with their recommendations yet, and so I don't know if there will be contraindications. Today in the FDA meeting, there was some discussion around, co-administration, because there aren't data yet. I hope from a practical perspective right now, it is December. I hope that most of our elderly population has already gotten their flu vaccine. That would be my hope. Personally, my suggestion would be, this is a vaccine with a lot of side effects. So is the shingles vaccine. I would not give them together. I think you can, I think there's probably a little bit of latitude around the shingles vaccine. And if for people who haven't already gotten it, and I would suggest receiving, if you're in line to receive the COVID vaccine, you should get that first and maybe put off the shingles vaccine for, a month or two, something like that.
And then another, question that had come through was, what if you're involved in getting the vaccine, you get the first dose, and then between that and your second dose, you get COVID and you're positive for COVID? Is that going to adjust anything with the administration of your second dose? Do you still go ahead and go through with that, or are there any thoughts that have been looked at from that standpoint?
I don't, so the answer is I don't think we have data on that. I think it would be hard for me to imagine that there is harm in that. Is it, do we know that immunologically it's 100% necessary? Maybe maybe your infection is a functional booster dose, and maybe you don't 100% need the second dose, but I would say we don't have data to address it. And so I would probably still receive a second dose.
And then, after you're receiving your second dose, is there a particular window they've been able to determine, okay, it may take 2 weeks till you start to develop the immunity, or, is there a time course that they've been able to identify yet at a minimum, or?
Yeah, so it has to do with when, the time points at which they measured immunity. So as I recall, the first time point was about a month after that second dose. So we don't necessarily know within that window, was it 2 weeks, was it 3 weeks, was it 4 weeks? By 4 weeks, people had really strong antibody responses. And people certainly develop antibody responses after their first dose, not quite as high as they do after their second dose. So there is some immunity after a first dose.
And then a lot of people are curious about, I know this wasn't studied in children at this stage, and the seriousness of the illness is not as, fortunately, is not as severe as what we're seeing rates as it is with our elderly population. So we've been lucky there on that front. But when do you feel that children would be looked at as trial candidates potentially at some point?
Yeah, so I will say, so Pfizer actually talked a little bit about this today. There are trials actually going on in children, older children, with a Pfizer vaccine right now. So they have trials in children ages 12 and up. Those trials are ongoing. There was actually fairly intense debate at the FDA meeting today about whether the EUA should include individuals 16 and above or 18 and above, because they did have some data from 16 to 18-year-olds, a very small number of individuals. And it was a rather intense debate. At the end of the day, they were asked to vote on 16 and above, and there was a favorable vote, but with a little dissension just around that 16 to 18-year age range. I think these trials will age de-escalate into younger populations of children. I think ultimately we will see these vaccines in children. One thing that I think will be important is, these inflammatory responses that I described. The younger you are, think about all the, people with their own children, that they get fevers at the drop of a hat, right? When you're 1 and 2 and 3 years old. So it may be, in fact, that the dose of vaccine will actually need to decrease in these younger children compared to adults, but we'll see over time. But Pfizer is committed to, over time, evaluating these vaccines in children, and I think other companies will follow suit.
Yeah, this is just to give us our audience, hopefully everybody's still listening, and I think this is a great discussion we're having, a lot longer than we had thought, but certainly some valuable information, so we appreciate it. These are just numbers recently of what's happening in our county. If you look at the age groups, and that's why we take a look at populations and what's there, and you can certainly see, what the case numbers are for our younger individuals, and what we're looking at the seriousness. By all means, any number here is serious, but when you look at our older population, and again, we're in the central part east of Florida, Dr. Karron. I don't know if you've been to the Space Coast over here, but that's where we are. And so you can definitely see our aging population and what happens with that serious illness. And so what Dr. Rifkes was saying, when we're looking at targeting these groups, we're hopeful that we'll see trends in a better direction for them as well. And you can see the number of individuals comprises almost 9% of those infected at long-term care in our county. And so that's why it's such a, unique population. But these are just numbers to keep in mind. I think when we did this back in July and August, we looked at these same numbers and they weren't anywhere near the numbers they are today as well. So that's why we kind of put those as a point. And I think this was, as you mentioned earlier, from the Moderna study, they were putting bar graphs, and these are the graphs that you had discussed about different populations and the breakdown of those populations. And what they did is they kind of showed that you could see people that had comorbidities in the study, what were the ages of individuals with severe disease. They kind of did a distribution regarding gender and age, and then also tried to give an idea of who they put into their study, so you can get a sense of a diverse group of what they were looking at. And I think this is what you had said that they shared publicly as well. I'm trying to think what else we can ask you this evening. I know there's been some questions coming through the chat as well. So I'm going to try to see if Dr. Fear, if you're still online and want to field some of those questions for us, that'd be great. this is kind of the vaccination plan, in Florida. This is mostly what Dr. Rivkees had mentioned, and what the goals were of that as well. And you can see here, this is what the Florida time phase vaccination strategy was looking like as he kind of outlined it. This again is the draft that they had put out in October. So I'm sure that there's been some change, but it does demonstrate that there's been some pre-planning, as you mentioned, Dr. Karron, in terms of what's been going on from that standpoint as well. One of the things that I'm curious to know about with the results that you see, is it the fact that, people have not had severe illness? Is that one of the most promising things that you could see from these studies and the results that you're getting, is the likelihood that there's still possible risk of, transmission, but the fact that, the vaccines themselves seem to, give you that basically severe illness to zero. I mean, and that's pretty striking. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think the severe illness to zero is striking. I think actually 94-95% prevention of any illness is pretty striking. I think you're completely right on the transmission issue. And, what I sort of say to people is, just because you're vaccinated, it's not time to throw away your masks. It's not time to stop social distancing. It's not that we know that these vaccines won't prevent transmission. It's that we just don't know. We don't have those data yet. Again, this was a subject of discussion today, but we don't know that. And so until we have herd immunity through vaccination, through direct immunity, because we vaccinated our population, we still have to protect others because we don't know that we can't transmit even if we've been vaccinated.
One other question that came through, it looks like you answered the one about the mRNA spike, was, and I know we've been hearing these rumors about autoimmune disease development, including HIV from the vaccine, but that seems to be more of a social media thing than it has been a thing that's actually been truthful, but maybe you can answer that rumor.
Yeah, so I mean, what I would say is, my understanding is that there's no evidence of developing, I guess the question would be, I mean, HIV, who know, that that makes no sense. I think the question about, say, anti-RNA antibodies, could you, that's at least maybe a question worth asking. And I think people have looked at that as part of the safety studies and have not seen any evidence of anti-nucleic acid antibodies like you would see in that kind of autoimmune disease. I mean, it is a reason to continue to do long-term safety follow-up, as with any vaccine, just to be certain, but there's no evidence at this time.
And another question that just came through was, how do you personally, since you being a vaccinologist, how do you get through the hesitancy among people? I mean, this is asking about healthcare workers, but in general, about vaccine hesitancy. I recently just saw a meme that I've been showing around that says, Americans, I won't take the vaccine because I don't know what's in it. And then the joke is, Americans, oh, there's a McRib back out, I'm gonna go get that. It just kind of, to me, it's kind of a no-brainer, but I'll let you answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I say to people, and I'm interested in hearing about sort of healthcare worker hesitancy, because that's something that we need, obviously we need to address fairly immediately in the near term. In terms of hesitancy in the rest of the population, my answer to that has been a couple of things. One is, we will be rolling out these vaccines and millions of people will get them. And right now, we have a mismatch between the amount of vaccine that we have available and the number of people who want to get it. So I don't think we need to address general hesitancy tomorrow, because I think what is going to happen, when you think about other vaccine hesitancy, it's against a static background, right? Measles, we have measles vaccine for everybody. If you don't give measles vaccines, then you have measles outbreaks. But here we're in a situation where we're going to be rolling out vaccine, and people will be able to see that individuals are getting it, and that the vaccine, you know, doesn't have, aside from the fact that it make you feel crummy for a day or so, it doesn't have safety effects. The other thing that I say is, you know, I think a way to approach people is, if you want to, and maybe it's not as much of a, I'm glad to hear it's not as much of a problem in Brevard County, but it sure is a problem where I live here in Washington, D.C. If you want to get back to the things in your life that matter to you, if you want to have big family gatherings, if you want to go to sporting events, for us, if you want to have your kids in schools, if you, you know, whatever it is in life that you really enjoy and care about, we are not going to be able to get back to life as we knew it in any way until we have a large portion of the population vaccinated. And I think the response to people is, you know, you don't want to hold your community back. You don't want to be the reason that we as a community can't move forward. So at least that's something that we've been batting around a bit. And that I think I do think there are populations of people who are not among the usual vaccine hesitant. There are people who are vaccine hesitant because they say, look at how fast this has been done. I'm not sure I trust the agencies that have been doing this. And I think what we say to them is some of the stuff that I talked about earlier tonight about how we were able to do this so quickly, what we have in place to assess vaccine safety, and then the fact that this will be rolled out over time. So.
And then Dr. Rivke's just asked another question, which was how much protection is provided after one dose, if that was analyzed, and for those that don't get a second dose, and based on available data about retrogenicity from Pfizer and Moderna, would you prefer one over the other in a particular age group or in a particular situation? And that was kind of my question as well. You know, if they're both available, is there a specific one that you pick over the other one at this point?
Yeah. So, so maybe to answer the first question, Pfizer did, and like I said, next week we'll get to see Moderna's data in detail. This week we got to see Pfizer's, and again, it's amazing. This is all publicly available. I can send you the links, but Pfizer did have a very small number of people that they were able, that had received a single dose, that they were able to look at immune response in after just that single dose, and they were able to see good antibody responses, but it wasn't enough people to really be able to look at efficacy of a single dose. So they don't really have those data. As between these two vaccines, my own view is they're pretty much superimposable. And I haven't seen myself yet data that would make me choose one over the other. I think they're much more similar than they are different.
So you don't think that one being live and activated has any benefit, especially for people who have any of these other disease processes or anything going on, has any benefit over the other?
So these are both so the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are both mRNA vaccines. They're right. They're and like I said, the shell, that lipid nanoparticle is probably a little different from between the two, but the guts of the thing, the mRNA itself, is just about identical between the two.
And Dr. Karron, just out of curiosity, what are your thoughts on some of these single dose vaccines that may be coming out? I know, I'm trying to remember who it was with one of these companies. I know they did a single dose trial, and then recently they were looking at a second dose as to what would happen, right? Surprising. So I don't know if you have any knowledge to share about those potentially.
So the only one, and there may be others for the U.S. That I'm not aware of, but the one that I'm aware of that was a single dose is the Janssen vaccine, the J&J vaccine, adenovirus. And I'd like to, I guess I'd like to see the data. I haven't seen enough of the data to be able to opine on that. You know, my gut sense is that most of these vaccines we may need 2 doses for. We'll see. We'll see.
And just as a comment about the vaccine hesitancy in healthcare workers, you know, as a healthcare worker, right, and then also as someone whose wife is the pulmonary critical care physician, you know, I think we all had questions about, you know, do you get the vaccine? Do you not get the vaccine? If it's offered to you, should you take it? Should you not take it? I think, you know, platforms like this where we can actually hear from people that study this, know this, you know, help us out to make good decisions in terms of what we want to do. And I think one of the other things is leaders in our community, the healthcare leaders, you know, taking the initiative and saying, okay, whether it's a photo of them getting their vaccine or whether it's them putting out a letter saying, this is why I'm doing this. I think, you know, that helps to ease some tension, not only in our peers, but I think it also helps to ease tension with our patients, because we're going to be the ones at some point, they're going to say, if my doctor's not doing it, should I be taking it? You know, and I think that's something that you might see in some of the hospital settings, where if you have a leading infectious disease or a pulmonary specialist or an intensivist, you know, kind of hesitant, you know, it may have a chain reaction potentially. So I think when you have your CMO or when you have some of these leaders in your organizations having that message, I think that helps. And I'd like to get Dr. Rivke's thoughts on that as well with leadership. You know.
So that sounds like a great idea or suggestion, and I can actually send a email to the FMA leadership in regards to that. They did this is Physicians Wearing Masks campaign, and I think a great campaign that we can do here in the state of Florida to encourage some of that hesitancy is to post videos of you know, physicians getting the vaccine, just like they showed that I think it was a 94-year-old lady in Great Britain was the first one to receive the vaccine there. So I can actually send that email up to help with that as well. I think that's a great idea.
Sounds like you got your 2021 project, President Fear. Excellent.
That's an easy one. I think that'll be that. I can send that email to the president and the guys in the leadership there. I think that they would easily do that. I don't know if you heard as I was chit-chatting, I didn't turn my video off. I was outside in the dark there. We just had a Falcon Heavy go off here in the Space Coast for they were launching a spy satellite. I don't know if you could hear the rumble around of my computer.
But I'll give everybody, if anybody has any more questions, now's the time to do it. Otherwise, I'm going to give our closing remarks. If Dr. Rivke's, if you want to lead us off with some closing remarks, just to the group that's still on with us, that you'd like to share.
Yeah, first, I mean, you know, this is a great conversation to have. Learned a lot on this call. You know, one of the things we talk about is, you know, it seems every day we're learning something new about COVID. And these are new vaccines. These are new technologies, really exciting, incredible promise to be able to get a vaccine so soon. So we'll have to keep an eye out. You know, the issue, you know, is, you know, the line is, the key is vaccination, not the vaccine. And that's the hurdle we're all going to have to overcome. And, you know, we have surveyed, you know, the hospitals, and we're trying to get hospitals to roster those individuals who are in the high risk exposure group to want to get vaccinated, and also getting some information about individuals, the percent who want to get vaccinated, both in hospitals and also long-term care facilities. And I would say that this is an opportunity. You know, I like the point, you know, for those of us at healthcare in the front lines, role models in our community, you know, to really be, you know, show the public that, you know, we have confidence in the ability to do this. Obviously, it's going to take a while to build the confidence in the community for this, but, you know, all of you on this call really play an important role in this messaging. So, you know, one of the points that Ruth had mentioned early on, it, you know, really is incredible that, you know, within a year, you know, we already, you know, we didn't have the sequence until after the turn of the year, and here we are, have a vaccine. So again, we know this is an incredibly harsh virus, and this vaccine really gives us a ray of hope and really does give us a path back to normalcy.
Thank you, Dr. Rifke. And Dr. Karron, if you'd like to make some closing remarks, that'd be great.
Well, first, I really enjoyed this, and thank you for inviting me. The only thing I was thinking that I wanted to say as we were talking about physicians and examples is my daughter's a pediatric resident at Seattle Children's Hospital, and we found out yesterday that she's going to be able to get vaccine next week. And my husband and I are also both physicians, but we're going to be, you know, further down on the list. But I said to him, so I'm going to be able to sleep better because, you know, I'm going to know that she's vaccinated. And, you know, that's how I approach it, that I'm thrilled that my daughter's going to get vaccine. Personally, I'm going to get vaccine as soon as my turn in line comes up. Just to end with that and to say that it was really a pleasure to have this conversation, and thank you for all of the great talking points and great questions. I really appreciated it.
Well, we enjoyed it as well. And Dr. Fear, if you want to say something as well.
I really don't have much to add. I really appreciate you guys both taking the time to spend with us tonight. I mean, this has been very educational for us, and we definitely look forward to putting it up for our other members to view who weren't able to make it tonight. But I know there's a lot of concerns, and I think that a lot of those things you guys were able to answer for us, and we'll take that out into our communities as well. And I literally was just writing the email to Matt Crowley for the FMA to go forward with that campaign. I think it'll be a good success here in our state.
Thank you, Dr. Fear. And I'll end with just a couple thoughts. One, it's been a great year, you know, as a president for the Brevard County Medical Society and helping lead this initiative and finding ways that we can inform our organization. And I appreciate you both and everybody on this call just for taking time out of your days to help educate us. And I think that's critical. I also think what we have to mention is, you know, even if we start these vaccines to roll out next week, and I applaud the governor and I applaud the Florida Health Department, Dr. Rifke, for making sure that we can do that. We may not see the benefits for some of these patients for quite some time, maybe another 6 weeks potentially, maybe another, you know, so we still have to be cautious in terms of what's happening in our communities now, that our frontline healthcare workers are still out there. The teams are doing a remarkable job. Our physicians, our nurses, our hospital systems, everybody is doing an incredible job, and we need to give them support. Help is there, help is coming. Continue to focus on the social distancing measures. We have another tool in our tool chest that we can use. And I think what you'll see in the data, hopefully, let's say maybe 2.5, 3 months from today, you know, you can, is going to be hopefully remarkable if when you see these drops in hospitalizations and severe illness in our elderly population. If that happens, and if that's what we're predicting, and that occurs, I don't think there's going to be hesitancy. I think there'll be a great appreciation for the work that was done and the ability to really make a huge impact in ways that we didn't think of in a short amount of time. But that's, I think, going to be in my mind, when you really see the results at that stage, is 2.5 months, maybe 3 months from today, when you start to see these numbers decline simply as a result of a vaccination program that's been implemented. So I want to thank everybody tonight for joining. It's been a true pleasure to be part of the Brevard County Medical Society, this program and others. Thank you all, and have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.